Excited to be here at my alma mater. I went to Florida State University about 15 years ago, which is crazy to think it was 15 years ago. It feels like yesterday. I was just walking through this campus, and right now it's actually a lot nicer. They've built so many different things, the basketball court, and I'm so excited to be here. I currently live in North Carolina, and people tell me where you went to study. I told them at the nicest campus right on the ocean. Just look behind you all, it's beautiful, and I'm so happy and proud that I got to study here at Florida State University, Panama City. I majored in communication, although in the beginning I was about to major in psychology. I minored in psychology at the end, and I want to tell you a story I had with one of my psychology professors who had a huge impact on my personal life. She told us one day in this psychology class about her son who was diagnosed with autism. And she said, you know, as a mom, when you have a child, you have so many aspirations for them. Maybe you hope that one day they'll become a doctor, they'll study, you wonder what they're going to study, what they're gonna grow up and do, and what impact they will have in their life. But she said, my son, he cannot even speak right now. He can't even say one word. And she said, right now, my aspiration for my son is that one day, I hope he can just say, Mom, I love you. That's all I want. Her words really pierced my heart. The whole class was super emotional that day because she showed us a part of herself that we hadn't seen before in all these psychology classes. She shared her story with us. And sometimes that's how we grow. We grow through each other's stories. And little did I know that 8 years after this conversation with her, I would have a daughter who is now here on this room, at this room right here, and she would not be able to speak or use her voice. So this doctor and this professor's story carried me through in my own life. And sometimes we're carried through stories. When you know that somebody went through a hardship that you're going through now, you say, you know what, I can do it, they didn't. And this is much what the Quran is about. The Quran, the book of God for Muslims, is not just a book of guidance. It's a book of stories that carry us through our own lives and our own circumstances. In fact, I want to share with you a chapter of the Quran, chapter 11. And it's full of prophet stories, one after the next. It speaks of Prophet Abraham, Prophet Noah, Prophet Moses, Prophet Lot. And you go from story to story to story to story. But then at the very end of this chapter, God tells us why these stories are here. In the end of this chapter, God says, all of these stories are here to reassure your heart. That's the point of these stories in the Quran, that your heart needs reassurance. And sometimes you as a person are going to go through circumstances that you can relate to a different story. Prophet Noah, for example, in the Quran, he says, oh God, I am overwhelmed, I need your support. And it's something so simple, you would think, I'm overwhelmed. And how many of us have ever felt overwhelmed? Raise of hands. Yes, that's everybody in the room. So this is something, an emotion that you can relate to as a human being. And also Prophet Moses, he's stuck at sea. He feels constricted perhaps. Pharaoh and the armies behind him, the Red Sea is in front of him. But then he says, God is with me, he will guide me through this. And sometimes we're that person who feels stuck in a circumstance that has come and showed up on our door. And we're the person who has this leap of faith and says, God won't leave me. God will show me the way. So this month of Ramadan for Muslims is the month of the Quran, where we come back to the Quran more and we can find stories that relate to us on an individual level. And my daughter Maryam was born with child syndrome. She's right here, and this syndrome is so rare that only 60 people in the world ever had the same syndrome. And in fact, when I was pregnant with her, they didn't even have a diagnosis at that point. So I felt lost, scared, alone. I didn't know what would happen. But then I opened the inspiration for Muslims, the Quran, and I opened it and I read the chapter of the Ali Imran, which is the family of Mary. Mary in the Quran is Maryam. So in this chapter that relates her story, it says, God has chosen you, O Mary. God has chosen you to be above all women, that you are chosen for this task of carrying Jesus, the prophet of God, the only child to be born without a father. And in that moment, I sat there and I thought, Mary, the mother of Jesus, was chosen by God for this task. And just as she was chosen, this baby who was then in my womb, who no doctor could know what's going on, I said, she's also chosen. Whatever circumstance she has, whatever diagnosis she has, it's chosen by God. And it's at that moment that I decided to name her Maryam, or Mary, after the chosen woman of God. So back to Ramadan. Ramadan is the month that we believe as Muslims that the Quran was revealed. And if you walk into any mosque in America or in the world in Ramadan at night after we break our fast, you'll hear the Quran being recited for hours. And in fact, most mosques all over the world will complete the Holy Quran, including the mosque here in Panama City, from cover to cover, from beginning to end. All 114 chapters will be heard on the microphone. So it is a time for us as Muslims to reconnect with this book that came to reassure our hearts through various stories, through the circumstances also that we will be going through. And God introduces the Quran in chapter 2 as a book that has absolutely no doubt. And that is something that as a human being, you want to hold on to something that can carry you through, something substantial. And I'll give you an example. I studied psychology, and I remember at Gulf Coast Community College when I studied, we took children's psychology classes. And right now, there's research that refutes what I studied. Right? Maybe I studied something and they said, this is how you parent, this is the current research right now, this is the best way to parent. But now, like 20 years later, they said, actually, this is triggering children. This is the right research now. So research is constantly being evolved because it's man-made. We're constantly rediscovering the right things, what to do. But the book of God, however, is something that cannot be refuted. It is the book of God, the God who is right now guiding my heart to be beyond my own control. The God who is allowing me to speak right now. The God who is allowing you to hear what I am saying. So if his words have no doubt in them, they are not to be refuted. So this only invites Muslims to come to the Quran with more conviction and more faith that these words are words that can carry me through my life. And I can study them. And speaking of studying, the first verse revealed out of the Quran was read. Iqra. That was the first verse ever revealed in the entire Quran out of thousands of verses. Read, which shows the importance of educating yourself. And not just educating yourself, but God says in this verse, Iqra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq. Read in the name of your Lord. And scholars also say it means read by the aid of your Lord. Because we cannot even read without God enabling us to read. And reading is beyond just reading and educating yourselves. Because when you're reading, you're seeking to understand something. So God invites us as Muslims, don't just read on your own. Don't just seek to understand your life by yourself, but seek to understand your life through the God who created you. Because sometimes we won't know why something is happening. We can't make sense of it with our own limited senses. So God tells us, you can trust me. God is all wise, as it said in the Quran. God is the one who is all compassionate, all merciful. So no situation that comes to you is detached from his mercy. So that always allows us to seek to understand our circumstances by his lens, by the way he views things, and he tells us he is, rather than through our own limited senses. And in these verses that were first revealed, after God says read, the 5th verse of this chapter will say, عَلَّمَ الْإِنسَانَ مَا لَمْ يَعْلَمْ, that God will teach a human being what they never knew. And I'll tell you a story of what this verse always reminds me of. How sometimes God will teach you something and you don't know that you're even able to be taught through this way. Sometimes we think that we can only be taught in a certain lens, but God will show us how we can actually be taught. And my daughter Maryam, who I spoke of, who they told us when she was 7 months old, you'll never be able to hear her voice because of the tracheostomy, of the surgery she had to get. And I accepted that at that moment. But then 4 years later, the speech therapist who was at our house with me, we discovered that actually Maryam can communicate. Maybe not in the way we thought she would normally communicate like most other people, but she could communicate through typing. In fact, the speech tablet is right next to her. And that's how she communicates. We figured out that at 4 years old, if you gave her a tablet, she could spell for you exactly what she wants. In fact, the first thing she ever said was, she said, "I want my elephant." And she spelled it perfectly. And that is something I didn't even know my own daughter could do, and she had been living with me for 4 years. But it just took us to invite her to writing on a tablet. And we discovered she knew something that we thought was impossible. And that is how God will teach us things that we never knew could actually happen, so long as we continue to open our minds to what He will show us. So the gist of it is that this month of Ramadan is not just the month of fasting, but it's the month of reconnecting ourselves to the book of God, to these divine words that help us heal through the circumstances of life, and we can find stories that relate to us on an individual level. And if you think of your day-to-day life as a Muslim, and I'll speak of myself, outside of Ramadan, sometimes we get so detached from the reality of what this world is about that we start living in, what am I gonna eat today? No, I don't feel like this today. No, where am I gonna have my coffee? I'm a coffee person. Anybody coffee people here? Which cafe am I gonna have my coffee today? What flavor syrup do I wanna put in it? We get so lost in this world sometimes, but then when Ramadan comes, this is a time to detach from the day-to-day life and actually soak into what is real. The reality of returning to God. The reality that God has given us a book of guidance, a book of stories. So this is the time for us to, instead of thinking about what am I gonna eat for lunch today, we think of how can I connect to God better today. This is what Ramadan means for Muslims. It is feeding our soul. So I pray that today we can feed our soul together and then feed our bodies and eat after the break of fast. Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you.
I'll take a picture to be recorded in our neighbors.